Good evening, everyone. I wanted to take a few minutes tonight to go over some of the readings from Gilbert and Terrell, and also to highlight a few things from the policy brief that you will be working on for this weekend. So first is the readings. I posted a summary of the readings with some PowerPoint slides highlighting the things that I think are most relevant for your current knowledge, future knowledge, and relation to the policy brief. Okay, so the first is who benefits, and they talked about universalism versus selectivity. And this is where we consider something to be a right, a universal right that applies to the entire population. So the first thing we may think of is education, that today it is a basic right that all children in the United States are entitled to education. However, the compulsory age is a state designated determination. So that is the age at which you begin school and the age in which you are required to be in school until. So Pennsylvania is one of two states that the compulsory age is not until age 8. So you technically do not need to be in school until age 8. At Pennsylvania, for dropout, you can be signed out by a parent at age 16, and at age 17, you can sign yourself out with some parameters that you have a job, that you're in some sort of training program. So each state sets its parameters for dropout, quote unquote, signing yourself out. Selectivity denotes a benefit that's made available on the basis of need. So Social Security disability, SSI, SSDI, is determined by eligibility based on the factor that you are not able to work and it is likely to continue for a prolonged period that makes you eligible. Okay, so then it talks about allocative principles and institutional and residual concepts of social welfare. So an institutional concept kind of goes with universalism in the sense that institutional is first line function of society that we should provide for people's basic needs. Residual is it's a temporary necessity when normal channels for meeting the needs fail. So, for example, after a natural disaster, we have some residual services that jump up and provide care for the community. Uh, we have homeless shelters that provide services, but it's seen as only being temporary because your normal channels of housing aren't meeting people's needs. Whereas others would say housing should be a right, it should be more universal and institutionalized so that all people have access to affordable housing. Eligibility versus eligibility versus access is critical in understanding policies and programs. What causes the difference between a person being eligible and whether or not they actually access and use and receive a service. So, for example, the first is someone may be eligible but not aware of the service. We are seeing that right now with the Affordable Care Act and the government subsidies that are available for people, and some are not accessing them. So, is it an awareness issue? Um, Awareness of where food banks are in your community, awareness of where the domestic violence services are in your community. Possibly people are unable to benefit from the services, meaning that at this point in time, they can't uh, partake in the service for one reason or another. The next is potential beneficiaries may be deterred from seeking benefits. We put up barriers so that, we make people jump through hoops so that we want people not to access services. And we do that often for lower income individuals as compared to the ways in which we do this for quote unquote middle class individuals. We do a lot of publicity around tax breaks and tax credit initiatives or um, loans and financial aid for lower to middle class individuals, whereas we might put hoops for other individuals to access similar benefits. And then there are some who are just uninterested in benefiting. They don't think they need this service now. And so it's not a matter of access and it's not necessarily a matter of eligibility. It's a matter of, given this point in time, under these circumstances, this person is not accessing. For those who have experienced or work with chronic homeless, a lot of people in the United States say, well, that's their choice. They're choosing to live on the street. I like to think about it in such a way that at this moment in time, under these circumstances, this individual does not see the necessity or value in accessing that service. And I think we all make that choice on a daily basis. We just tend to have a more negative view of individuals that are, for example, chronically homeless. Next, we talk about basic forms and whether we are providing cash versus in kind. Over through the Tratner book, you read about the different ways that we provided social welfare over the years. There is an increasing argument in favor of in kind benefits, that we should not be giving people, tax dollars for to meet their basic needs. We should be in some ways meeting their needs in kind. We want to do things at the lowest cost possible to keep our taxes low. However, let's look at education. We raise our taxes to provide quality education in neighborhoods that have a higher tax base. We usually have, quote unquote, better schools. Isn't that a social welfare program? So we have to look at individual interest versus collective good, and who's driving the bus, whose interests are, providing or dictating how we provide the services that we provide to individuals, families, and communities. So this election is a perfect example of, a conversation about taxes and where money will be utilized, not utilized, where government money is going to be applied and who's going to pay for those services. Okay, then the next is looking at the drawbacks of in-kind benefits. There's some stigma attached, and you are restricted in terms of what you can receive if it's an in-kind benefit. You may not get the services or the needs met that you are seeking in the first place. The argument in favor of cash benefits is it's easy to use. If you receive, cash and you go out and utilize that cash, there's less stigma attached to that. And if the earned income tax credit is an example of this, we have given for many, many years now this. At income tax time, you go in, you declare your income, you identify your deductions, and then we give you, if you're a low enough income, we give you a tax credit. There's no stigma attached to that, and it's cash. So that is one way that we try to differentiate between an in-kind and, a cash generating program. Okay. And that program brings a lot of families out of poverty because that gets added into their annual income. The drawback of cash benefits is that the money may not be used for the intended purposes. Food stamps is an example. Lots of people critique how people use their food stamps, their nutritional assistance program. So, we can't control that at the point of the person shopping in the grocery store, although there are some limits set on what you can use food stamps for. Okay, so then we have the privatization and the commercialization of service delivery. I think it's very important that you understand the difference between the types of agencies. Many in the social work field struggle with this, and as you're going out, even now working in the agencies that you work for, and for future jobs, you're going to want to know whether this is a public agency, the Department of Health, Department of Public Welfare, the Office of Youth and Family Services, whether this is a private agency, a nonprofit, maybe a faith based organization, or is it a private for profit organization? A lot of our drug and alcohol providers are for profit. Some of our foster care agencies are for profit. Correctional institutions are becoming more and more for profit. So, what does that mean in terms of how services are provided? What does that mean in terms of the income that you might make as a social worker? What is the philosophy, the mission of the organization? And then the commercialization, whether or not the service is been commercialized or is it more grassroots, the for profit or the grassroots nonprofit, uh, over the years, the settlement house model. And next with this is, how are we looking at the future provision of public services? And again, I mentioned this, the criminal justice system is privatizing. The whole movement to cyber schools is, a different kind of school district that is private. What do we think about that? I have a child enrolled in Commonwealth Charter Academy, CCA. It's the largest cyber school in Pennsylvania. There are pros and cons to that. Faith-based and charitable choice. Okay, so we talked about that. All right, and sorry there, I had to pause for a second. Next, we look at the sources of funds. So voluntary agencies, charitable nonprofits are financed in some way with voluntary contributions, but more and more with state and federal funding through grants, and whether it's a block grant or it's a competitive grant. Uh, so that, is changing the landscape of social service programs. And third party reimbursement through insurance companies is important as well. Public agencies are agencies established by law and usually funded through tax dollars. And then for profit institutions are entrepreneurial. And so they are collecting from insurance companies. They maybe have a contract with the state or the federal government. And they are not only concerned with the provision of services, but also with a profit margin. They are looking at a bottom line, a cost, a unit cost, the delivery of services versus, an end marker that, their board, if it's a board, or their stockholders, if it's a public company that's, has stock, uh, they may be concerned with, what is the income, the profit to the shareholders. Next, we'll talk about the ways in which power is distributed in the United States or any country, and how that influences social welfare programs. So, concepts such as centralization, decentralization, and their ideologies. So, centralization is that power is concentrated nationally. Decentralization is that power is to the states and local governments. And so, one of the things that has made the United States both successful and has created challenges is the way that 250 years ago we created our government, in that we did not have a strong national government, such as like a monarchy after the English model. We allowed there to be checks and balances between the three parties that we talked about, forms of government that we talked about earlier in the semester, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. But we also have a balance between national and state and local, and that influences laws and policies and programs, and who makes the rules and how they get implemented, and what who's driving the bus, Who gets to decide who receives a service, who's going to pay for it, who determines how long it will be offered, what outcomes we're seeking. And so it's important that you understand some of that, when looking at policies and programs. How the money flows. Dual sovereignty is an expression that different levels of government operate more or less separately, and each level has autonomy. So the state is its own body, its own entity. The federal government is its own entity. And then, for example, the city of Philadelphia is an entity. Federalism is where the levels of government work together, and there's cooperation across state and federal. So, we have this, for example, with tariffs in trade. We have one currency in the United States. You don't have, money for the state of Pennsylvania and Maryland and Illinois and California. You have one currency. And that is what's happening right now in Europe as there are countries pulling out of the euro. It's this idea of, is it better to have decentralized, whether it's at a state level or a country level with currency, with money, or is it better to have one national federal currency, or European euro? So for homeless programs, initially it was a very much a local initiative back in the 70s. And then we realized very quickly that we couldn't end homelessness just at the local level. There needed to be more of a county and state and federal response. So states created the program emergency shelter grants, and the federal government, through the Stuart McKinney legislation, created HUD programs and the Continuum of Care initiative that is happening right now to fund permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and housing first programs across the United States. So continuing with this, we look at how the money flows, transfer of program funds that allows an agency to dispense, to the recipients of the service, to hire and appoint staff and to award contracts, whether it's from the state to an agency. And we need to look at, is that effective the way we're doing that? Or have we created more bureaucracies to the service getting to the people that it's intended to serve? Some conditional ways in which we've done this. The Great Society centralization programs were advanced for specific national purposes. You had national initiatives like food stamps and other poverty programs, Head Start. And then there have been times over the decades that we have devolved back to state and local control for the initiation of programs. I would say that right now we're more in a centralizing initiative at the state and federal level, where we want communities to, the responsibility is not on a local community. I see this actually happening in the homeless service delivery system, where they want continuum of care to be broadly across communities. So right now in Pennsylvania, the eastern part of Pennsylvania is one continuum of care serving 33 counties. And the expectation from HUD is fluidity, so that if you're homeless in Montour County, that you could receive services from a neighboring county if there were no beds, for example, in Montour County. The other thing is categorical grants that specify who is to be served, the benefits to be received, and how that service delivery is going to be organized. So the government sets down some categorical grants with very specific guidelines to be met. Then the idea of match, you'll hear this in your agencies when you're applying for grants. Is there a match? Is it a cash match, meaning the organization has to raise some additional money to develop this program and implement it? Or is it an in-kind match, that the organization can say, this staff person who's already employed in the agency is going to provide some services to this program, and that's an in-kind match, or our building or some volunteers are in-kind matches. Um, In addition, we look at some beneficiary conditions, who can receive the services, in what areas can they receive the service, are there certain eligibility requirements to receive the service, and then procedural conditions. Does an agency have to implement a program in a certain way, and does a client have to apply in a certain way in order to access the service? And that's the end of my slideshow. All right, so the other thing that I want to talk to you about is your policy brief. Um, the I'm sure you know this from other courses, but there is a general syllabus that everyone uses. And so as an adjunct faculty, I use the syllabus that's given to me. When I read over this assignment and I look at what the requirement is in terms of the policy brief, I found it to be somewhat confusing. So I want to tell you what I'm looking for. Down here, you'll see that it says that it should be 2 to 3 pages right here, single spaced. So that's different than other things that you may have done in undergrad and graduate school where it was double spaced, and in block format, meaning that there is no indentation in this. It's full justified. So there's a format to a brief. I would prefer that you use some headings so that you can match up with the rubric that is here and the 5 sections that are in the rubric: the problem and population, um, the causes of the problem and the consequences of the problem, the options for responses, your recommendations for change, and how you think that change effort will have an impact on society and social work. Okay? If you have any questions as you're doing this, certainly reach out to me. The other thing is that the requirement for this is not APA formatting. You can use either footnotes or endnotes, but please be clear that if you're taking information from someone else, it needs to be acknowledged through a citation. Okay? If you have any questions as you're doing this, I know many of you can pull information from both your week 4 assignment and your week 5 posting on the discussion board to do this. Others had some gaps in what they've done, and I've talked to many of you either by email or on the phone. So if you feel like you still are uncertain or you have a gap that you'd like to talk about how to best meet that, please certainly reach out to me. The other thing is here where you're talking about options for response, and it says identify 3 to 4 possible options through policies or programs. And in my response to you in your week 5 discussion forums, I suggested that you look at the ways in which policies lead to programs, and that would make it a very strong answer. Okay. If you have any questions on that, let me know. So otherwise, I hope you all are having a very great week, and I will be in touch soon. Thank you. Have a great night.